The morning fog hung thick over the Columbia River, wrapping the shipyard in grey silence. It was October, 1942, and along the riverbank where timber mills once stood, a different kind of forest had risen. Steel cranes towered against the mist, their shadows stretching across assemblyways that stretched nearly a quarter-mile. The air smelled of welding flux and fresh paint, of coffee from thermos bottles and the damp chill of the Pacific Northwest. Inside a makeshift office overlooking the yard, a group of Navy officers stood with their arms crossed, skepticism carved into their faces. They had travelled from Washington to Vancouver, not the one in Canada, but the smaller city across the river from Portland, Oregon. Before them stood Henry Kaiser, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and the determined set of someone who had built dams in deserts and believed concrete could solve anything. He was pointing at blueprints spread across a table scarred by coffee rings and cigarette burns. 15 Escort carriers, Kaiser said, his voice calm but absolute. The officers exchanged glances. The youngest among them, a lieutenant commander with fresh ribbons on his chest, cleared his throat. Mr. Kaiser, with respect, the Navy's been building fleet carriers for years. It takes us 3, sometimes 4 years per ship. You're talking about launching more than 1 per month. Kaiser didn't blink. I'm not talking about it, Commander. I'm promising it. The silence that followed was heavy with doubt. One of the senior captains, a man who had overseen construction at Newport News, spoke carefully. These aren't barges, sir. These are carriers, flight decks, hangar bays, catapults, arresting gear. The complexity alone can be simplified, Kaiser interrupted, not rudely, but with the certainty of someone who had already solved the problem in his mind. We'll prefabricate sections, use standardized parts, train workers on single tasks until they can do them blindfolded. Assembly line methods. What works for cars can work for ships. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The captain's face tightened. Mr. Kaiser, Henry Ford builds Model Ts, not warships. There's a reason naval architecture takes years of apprenticeship. You can't just hire welders off the street and expect. I can and I will, Kaiser said. He gestured toward the window where through the fog, faint shapes of workers moved like ghosts between half-formed hulls. Most of them never touched a ship before August. Farm boys from Idaho, loggers from Washington, women from Portland who were secretaries last year. They're learning, and they'll build these carriers because they have to. The officers said nothing. They looked at the blueprints again, at the ambitious timelines scrawled in Kaiser's handwriting. The ships he proposed were escort carriers, smaller cousins to the great fleet carriers that dominated the Pacific. They would be built on merchant ship hulls, simple and unglamorous, designed not for glory but for utility. Anti-submarine patrols, convoy protection, aircraft transport. The Navy needed them desperately, but needing something and building it were different wars. When does construction begin? The lieutenant commander asked finally, his tone suggesting he expected a date months away. Kaiser smiled faintly. It already has. The first hull went down 3 weeks ago. The room stilled. The captain who had spoken of apprenticeships leaned forward, his voice dropping. 3 weeks? We haven't even finalized the contracts. Contracts slow things down, Kaiser said. Wars don't wait for paperwork. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the shipyard in pieces. Wooden frames rose from concrete foundations. Cranes swung prefabricated steel plates through the air with surprising grace. Workers in coveralls and welding masks moved in coordinated streams, their movements already bearing the rhythm of repetition. The yard was chaos to an untrained eye, but beneath it ran a current of organization, a method that Kaiser had refined building the Grand Coulee Dam and the Oakland Bay Bridge. He saw construction not as craft but as system. Each task broken into components, each component assigned and timed. The officers lingered at the window, watching the workers. One whispered to another, "He's insane," but the whisper carried no conviction, only unease. Because if Kaiser was insane, then the Navy was desperate enough to trust madness. The Pacific War was bleeding ships faster than traditional yards could replace them. Japanese submarines prowled the convoy routes. Carriers were being sunk at Midway, at Coral Sea, at battles whose names were still being written. The United States needed hulls in the water, and it needed them now. Kaiser turned back to the blueprints. "Gentlemen, I'm not asking you to believe. I'm asking you to watch." And watch they did. Over the following weeks, those same officers returned periodically, their skepticism eroding with each visit. The first escort carrier, designated CVE-55, began to take shape with startling speed. Her hull, a converted C-3 cargo ship, was fitted with a flight deck that stretched 512 feet, wooden planks over steel, simple but effective. Below, hangar bays were welded into place by crews working in shifts that never stopped. Day bled into night, and night into day, marked only by the glow of arc welders and the clang of hammers on rivets. The workers themselves were a revelation. Men who had never seen the ocean now built the vessels that would sail it. Women operated cranes with the precision of surgeons, guiding tons of steel into place with hand signals and instinct. Kaiser's gamble was not just in speed, but in faith, that ordinary people, given purpose and training, could achieve what experts deemed impossible. By December of 1942, the first hull was nearing completion. The officers stood on the deck, their shoes echoing on fresh planking. The lieutenant commander ran his hand along a welded seam, testing it with the critical eye of a man trained to spot flaws. The weld held. He straightened, his expression unreadable. "How long until launch?" he asked. Kaiser checked his watch as if the question amused him. 86 days from keel laying to launch. She'll be in the water by February." The captain who had doubted him turned sharply. "February of next year?" "February of 1943, Kaiser confirmed. "And the second one will follow 60 days after that. Then the third. By summer, we'll be launching one every month. By fall, faster." The words hung in the cold air like a challenge. The officers had come expecting empty promises, propaganda to boost morale. Instead, they found steel rising from mud, schedules met, impossible timelines becoming routine. The skepticism that had armored them began to crack, but the true test was not in promises. It was in proof. And proof would come not in words, but in the moment a hull touched water for the first time, when the weight of doubt met the buoyancy of achievement. That moment was coming. The shipyard hummed with it, a low vibration that ran through the cranes and the concrete, through the hands of the workers and the hearts of those who watched. The war did not wait. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces dug into islands with names Americans struggled to pronounce. In the Atlantic, U-boats hunted convoys under moonless skies. The need for ships was not abstract. It was measured in lives, in tons of supplies reaching or failing to reach their destinations, in aircraft that needed decks to launch from and fuel to burn. Kaiser understood this in his bones. He did not build carriers for glory. He built them because the alternative was unthinkable. And in that Vancouver shipyard, surrounded by workers who believed because he did, the impossible began its quiet transformation into the inevitable. The first escort carrier would launch in February, as promised. But even then, the officers would not fully grasp what they were witnessing. Not until the 12th, the 13th, the 15th carrier slid into the Columbia River would they understand that Kaiser had not merely met a challenge. He had redefined what was possible. The fog thickened again, swallowing the yard in grey. Somewhere beyond it, the river flowed silent and cold, waiting to receive the first of many hulls. And in that waiting, history held its breath. The welding torches never stopped burning. Day and night, their blue-white flames carved brightness into the Columbia River fog, casting long shadows across assembly ways where steel took shape with startling speed. By January of 1943, the Vancouver shipyard had become a city unto itself, a sprawling industrial cathedral where more than 15,000 workers moved in synchronized motion, their lives measured in shifts, quotas, and the hiss of molten metal meeting cold air. Among them was Margaret Dalton, a 32-year-old mother of two, who 6 months earlier had been typing purchase orders for a Portland lumber company. Now she stood 70 feet above the river on a narrow scaffold, operating a crane that lifted prefabricated deck sections weighing several tons each. Her hands, once soft from office work, were calloused and sure. She wore coveralls, 2 sizes too large, and a welding cap that kept slipping over her eyes, but her movements betrayed no hesitation. The war had made her essential, and she knew it. Below her, crews swarmed over the hull of CVE 56, the second escort carrier to rise from Kaiser's assembly line. Its flight deck, still skeletal, stretched like a promise across the ship's spine. Workers riveted steel plates into place with rhythmic precision, the sound echoing across the water in staccato bursts. Each rivet was a small commitment, thousands of them binding together into something larger than any single person could comprehend. The foreman, a wiry man named Tom Briggs, who had built fishing boats in Alaska before the war, walked the deck with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He stopped periodically to inspect welds, running his fingers along seams with the care of a jeweler examining settings. Quality mattered. Kaiser's promise of speed meant nothing if the ships sank before they reached open water. Briggs understood this in a way that transcended orders. His son was serving on a destroyer somewhere in the South Pacific, and every weld he approved was a silent prayer that someone, somewhere, was building his boy's ship with the same care. "Dalton," he called up to the crane operator. "Bring the next section, starboard, slow and steady." Margaret adjusted the controls, her eyes fixed on the load swaying beneath her crane's hook. The section, a portion of the hangar deck, descended with agonizing precision, guided by men with ropes and hand signals. When it settled into place with a metallic groan, she exhaled. Another piece. Another step, closer. The Navy officers who had doubted Kaiser in October returned in February, this time with a rear admiral whose uniform bore more ribbons than seemed possible on a single chest. He was a man accustomed to command, to ships that took years to build and centuries of tradition to justify. He stood on the riverbank as CVE 55, now christened the Casablanca, prepared for launch. The ceremony was brief, almost perfunctory. No champagne bottles, no speeches that stretched into the afternoon. Kaiser himself stood to the side, watching with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had built dams that held back rivers. A ship was no different. The hull slid into the Columbia River with a sound like thunder rolling through valleys. Water surged and foamed, rushing to embrace the steel. The workers on the shore cheered, their voices raw from months of labor, and Margaret Dalton, still on her crane, watched with tears streaming down her cheeks that she did not bother to hide. She thought of her husband, a sergeant with the 1st Marine Division, and wondered if the ships she built might keep him safer, might bring him home. The admiral turned to Kaiser, his expression unreadable. 86 days, he said quietly. I didn't believe it. Kaiser nodded once. 83, actually. We finished ahead of schedule. The admiral said nothing more. He watched the Casablanca settle into the water, her hull dark against the pale sky, and for the first time allowed himself to imagine what 15 such ships might mean, not just for convoy protection or submarine patrols, but for the war itself. Speed was a weapon, production was power, and this shipyard, dismissed months ago as madness, was becoming the forge where that power was shaped. But launching one ship was not the same as launching 15. The officers knew this, Kaiser knew this, and so the work continued, relentless and unyielding. By March, CVE 56 was in the water. By April, CVE 57. The pace that had seemed impossible in October became routine by spring. Workers stopped marveling at what they built and simply built. Margaret Dalton no longer thought about the impossibility of a woman operating heavy machinery. She thought only about precision, about the next load, the next shift, the next carrier taking shape beneath her crane. The yard itself evolved. What had been chaos in the fall became a kind of industrial ballet by winter's end. Prefabrication bays churned out standardized components, bulkheads, deck sections, gun mounts that fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of an inch. Welders worked from detailed diagrams, their tasks simplified to repeatable actions. A man might spend 12 hours a day welding the same type of seam over and over until his hands moved with unconscious perfection. It was not craftsmanship in the traditional sense. It was something newer, something the world had never seen at this scale. Mass production applied not to cars or radios, but to ships of war. Tom Briggs walked the yards late one night, unable to sleep. The graveyard shift moved through pools of floodlight, their shadows long and distorted. He stopped at the hull of CVE 60, not yet named, still raw steel and open frames. In 6 weeks, it would have a flight deck. In 10, it would touch water. The thought was dizzying. He had spent 3 years building a single fishing trawler once, and here they were launching carriers faster than he could track. A young welder, barely 20, approached him with a question about a tricky joint. Briggs showed him the technique, guiding the boy's hands until the torch moved correctly. When the weld cooled, it was clean and strong. The boy grinned, exhausted but proud. Briggs clapped his shoulder. Good work. Now do it 900 more times. The boy laughed, a sound that carried across the water and vanished into the night. But the human cost of such speed was not invisible. Workers collapsed from exhaustion. Accidents, though rare, were brutal when they occurred. A man fell from scaffolding in May and did not survive. The yard paused for an hour, a funeral held among the cranes, and then resumed. The war did not pause for grief. It only accumulated losses and drove forward. Margaret Dalton felt the weight of it some mornings when she arrived before dawn, the river still dark and the stars fading. She thought of the men who would crew these carriers, boys younger than her eldest son, sailing into battles she could not imagine. Her work was not abstract, it was achingly real. Every rivet, every weld, every flight deck section she guided into place was a small defiance against the forces that sought to destroy what she loved. The Japanese, distant and unseen, were learning of this production through captured documents and intelligence reports. In planning rooms in Tokyo, officers studied photographs of Kaiser's yards with expressions of disbelief. 15 carriers in a year from a single shipyard? Impossible. It had to be propaganda, American exaggeration designed to demoralize. But the photographs did not lie. The hulls were real. The pace was real. One Japanese naval planner reportedly wrote in his diary, "If they can build ships as they build automobiles, then we are facing not an enemy, but a machine." He was right. The United States had weaponized its industrial capacity, turning the same methods that had made it wealthy in peace into the arsenal that would crush its enemies in war. Kaiser's yard was only one piece of that machine, but it was a piece that hummed with terrifying efficiency. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By summer of 1943, the doubters had fallen silent. The Escort carriers rolled from the Vancouver yard with the regularity of freight trains. CVE 61, CVE 62, CVE 63. Each one bore a name now Coral Sea, Corregidor, Mission Bay, names that honored battles and places already written into American sacrifice. The workers learned these names and spoke them with reverence, as though christening the ships gave them souls. The rear admiral who had watched the Casablanca launch returned in July. He stood on the deck of CVE 65, still incomplete but already recognizable as a carrier. He ran his hand along a welded joint and nodded slowly. "Mr. Kaiser," he said, "I came here in February thinking you were a dreamer. I was wrong. You're a miracle worker." Kaiser shook his head. "Not me, Admiral. Them." He gestured toward the workers streaming across the yard, thousands of them, anonymous in their coveralls and helmets. "They're the miracle. I just gave them a system." The Admiral watched the workers for a long moment. Then he turned back to Kaiser. "How many more can you build?" Kaiser's answer was immediate. "As many as you need." And he meant it. By autumn, the yard had refined its process to the point where a carrier could be completed in under 60 days from keel to launch. 15 ships in 12 months was no longer a boast. It was simply fact, recorded in logbooks and photographs, proven by the hulls floating in the Columbia River, waiting for their final fittings before steaming toward war. But the true measure of Kaiser's achievement was not in numbers alone. It was in what those numbers meant. Each escort carrier freed a fleet carrier for offensive operations. Each one protected convoys that fed the war machine. Each one carried aircraft that hunted submarines, that provided air cover, that turned the vast emptiness of the Pacific into contested space. Margaret Dalton did not think in such grand terms. She thought in crane loads and shift changes, in letters from her husband, and the growing hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the war might end before her sons were old enough to fight. But she felt the significance in her bones, in the ache of her shoulders and the calluses on her palms. She was building something that mattered. They all were. As 1943 bled into 1944, the yard continued its relentless rhythm. The 15th carrier, CVE 69, launched in October, exactly 12 months after Kaiser's promise to the skeptical Navy officers. The feat was documented, photographed, celebrated briefly, and then set aside. Because the war was not over, the yards could not stop. And so they didn't. Kaiser stood on the riverbank that October morning, watching CVE 69 slide into the water. The fog had lifted, and for once the sun broke through, turning the Columbia River into molten silver. He thought of all the doubters, the experts who had said it couldn't be done, the traditions that insisted ships required years, not months. He had not argued with them. He had simply built. Beside him, Tom Briggs smiled faintly. 15 in 12, he murmured. Who would have believed it? Kaiser turned to him. Anyone who watched these workers. They believed it from the start, and perhaps that was the truest measure of all. The faith that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when the need was great enough and the system clear enough. The Vancouver yard had proven something beyond shipbuilding. It had proven that America's strength was not in its generals or its steel alone, but in the hands and hearts of people who refused to accept that anything was impossible. The carriers steamed toward the Pacific, their decks empty but ready, their hulls bearing the fingerprints of 15,000 workers who would never see the battles they enabled. And in that anonymity, in that quiet service, lay a legacy that would outlast any single ship. The escort carriers that slid from Kaiser's yards did not sail into legend. They sailed into work, unglamorous, relentless work that asked nothing of glory and everything of endurance. By the spring of 1944, the ships built in Vancouver were scattered across 2 oceans, their flight decks pitching in swells, their crews learning that survival meant vigilance measured in 18-hour watches and eyes burning from salt spray. The Casablanca, first of Kaiser's children, found herself in the North Atlantic hunting German U-boats that stalked convoys like wolves in winter fog. Her aircraft, stubby Wildcats and lumbering Avengers, launched from decks slick with ice, their engines coughing in the cold before roaring to life. The carrier herself was never meant to be beautiful. Her flight deck was wood over steel, her hangar bay cramped, her speed modest. But she was there, and that was what mattered. In the Pacific, the Coral Sea provided air cover for landings at Saipan, her pilots flying close support missions that turned jungles into infernos. The Corregidor escorted troop transports across the vast emptiness between Hawaii and the Philippines, her radar scanning horizons for threats that came as often from below the waves as above them. These carriers were not the stars of newsreels. They were the workhorses, the unglamorous backbone of a naval war fought across distances so vast that even the ocean seemed to lose patience with itself. Back in Vancouver, Margaret Dalton read letters from sailors who served on ships she had helped build. The letters arrived sporadically, forwarded through Navy channels, written by men who wanted to thank the workers they would never meet. One letter, creased and stained with seawater, described how the Mission Bay had survived a kamikaze strike off Leyte Gulf, her flight deck torn but her hull intact, her crew praising the welds that held when everything else shattered. Margaret kept that letter in her locker, reading it when the exhaustion became too heavy, when the 12-hour shifts blurred into each other and her hands ached so badly she could barely grip the crane controls. The letter reminded her that the steel she moved was not abstract. It was life, measured in men who came home because a weld held, because a deck section fit perfectly, because 15,000 workers in a foggy shipyard had refused to believe that speed and quality were enemies. By the autumn of 1944, the strategic impact of Kaiser's escort carriers had become undeniable. The Navy's own assessments, buried in classified reports that would not surface for decades, concluded that the rapid deployment of CVEs had shortened the Atlantic U-boat campaign by an estimated 6 months. In the Pacific, the carriers freed fleet carriers like the Enterprise and Yorktown for offensive strikes, allowing the Navy to maintain pressure on Japanese positions without sacrificing convoy protection. But statistics, however impressive, could not capture the human dimension of what had been built. Tom Briggs, the foreman who had walked the yards at night, received word in November that his son's destroyer had been escorted safely through a submarine zone by the corregidor. The news arrived in a brief telegram, clinical and factual, but Briggs read it 3 times before setting it down. He thought of the months he had spent inspecting welds on that very carrier, his fingers searching for flaws, his mind always circling back to his son somewhere on the other side of the world. He walked the yard that evening, past the hulls of new carriers already taking shape. Kaiser's promise of 15 in 12 months had been exceeded. The yard now produced them faster, the system refined to brutal efficiency. CVE 70, CVE 71, CVE 72. The numbers climbed like a tide that refused to recede, and with each launch, Briggs felt a strange mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing that every ship carried boys like his son into waters where steel and courage were tested in equal measure. The workers themselves began to change. The desperation of 1942, when every rivet felt like a personal battle against tyranny, had evolved into something quieter by 1945. The war was still brutal, still hungry for ships and men, but the outcome no longer felt uncertain. The yards had proven that America could outbuild any enemy, that its factories and rivers could birth fleets faster than they could be sunk. That knowledge carried its own weight, a responsibility to maintain the pace even as victory approached. Margaret Dalton noticed it in the younger workers, boys barely 18 who arrived fresh from high school, their hands soft and their eyes bright. They lacked the fear that had driven her generation, the visceral terror of those early months when defeat seemed possible. Instead, they carried a confidence bordering on arrogance, certain that American steel would always prevail. She envied them that certainty, even as it made her feel old at 33. One afternoon, she paused her crane to watch a new hull slide into the river. It was CVE 77, though she had stopped learning the names by then. There were too many, and they blurred together like the days themselves. But she watched anyway, because the moment of launch never lost its power. The hull entered the water with a sound like the earth splitting, and for a brief instant, the river seemed to hold its breath before accepting the weight. A young welder beside her, a girl no older than 20, shouted over the noise. "How many is that now?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She counted in her head, adding the months and the launches, the promises kept and the records shattered. "More than 20, she said finally. "Maybe 25. The girl grinned. "We're beating them with steel." Margaret nodded, but she did not share the girl's smile. She thought of the sailors who would crew that hull, of the oceans that would test it, of the mothers like her who waited for letters that sometimes never came. Victory was not clean. It was measured in ships that floated and men who returned, and the gap between those two numbers was a chasm filled with grief. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe had ended. The news reached the shipyard on a bright May morning, carried by radios crackling with static and voices choked with emotion. Workers stopped mid-task, wrenches and torches lowered, and listened as President Truman's voice announced Germany's surrender. There were cheers, brief and explosive, and then a strange silence. Because half the war remained, and the Pacific showed no signs of mercy, Kaiser himself visited the yard that day. He moved through the crowds, shaking hands, his face tired but resolute. He stopped at Margaret's crane, looking up at her with those wire-rimmed glasses catching the sunlight. "How are you holding up?" he asked. She considered lying, offering the easy assurance that she was fine, that the work was manageable. Instead, she told him the truth. "I'm tired, Mr. Kaiser, but I'll keep going," he nodded. "That's all any of us can do. Keep going until it's finished." "Will it finish?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Kaiser looked toward the river, where 2 carriers floated side by side, waiting for their final fittings. "Yes, he said quietly. But not because of me. Because of you. And everyone like you. The Japanese can't match this. He gestured toward the yard, toward the cranes and the workers and the endless rhythm of construction. They can't replace ships as fast as we build them. They can't sustain this pace. We've already won. They just don't know it yet. Margaret wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel the certainty he projected, the faith that production alone could end the war. But she had read too many letters, seen too many gold star flags hanging in Portland windows. Winning was not the same as surviving, and the distance between those words stretched across an ocean she could not see from her crane. The Japanese, besieged and desperate, had indeed recognized what Kaiser described. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed planning documents where Japanese naval officers calculated American production rates with mounting despair. One report, dated March of 1945, estimated that the United States was building carriers at a rate of 2 per month across all shipyards. The officer who wrote it concluded with a single sentence that spoke volumes. "We cannot sink them faster than they are built." That realization, buried in the grinding mathematics of industrial war, marked a kind of surrender long before the formal ceremonies. The Japanese had entered the conflict believing that spirit and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans had proven otherwise, not through any single battle, but through the relentless accumulation of ships, aircraft, and ammunition that flowed from yards like Vancouver with the inexorability of tides. By August of 1945, when atomic fire ended the war in a flash of light over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Kaiser's Vancouver yard had launched more than 30 escort carriers. The number was staggering, almost incomprehensible. 30 ships where experts had once doubted 15. 30 hulls that carried aircraft into battles across 2 oceans, that hunted submarines in the Atlantic's grey swells, that provided air cover for Marines wading ashore on islands whose names became American grief. The yard fell silent on August 15th, when Japan's surrender was announced. Workers gathered in clusters, radios held high, voices trembling as they listened to the news. Margaret Dalton stood beside her crane, tears streaming down her face, and thought of her husband who would finally come home, of the ships she had built that would no longer sail toward death. Around her, men and women embraced, strangers bound by months of shared exhaustion and purpose. Tom Briggs found himself unable to speak. He walked to the river's edge, where the water lapped gently against the pilings, and watched the carriers moored in rows like steel monuments to what they had achieved. His son was alive. The war was over, and yet he felt no triumph, only a bone-deep weariness that came from knowing what the victory had cost. In the months that followed, the yard transformed. The frantic pace slowed, then stopped. Contracts were cancelled. Workers were laid off by the thousands, their labour no longer needed in a world turning toward peace. Margaret Dalton returned to her children, to a quieter life that felt strange after years of industrial thunder. She never operated a crane again, but she dreamed of it sometimes, the weight of steel swaying beneath her controls, the precision required to lower it into place. The escort carriers themselves had varied fates. Some were decommissioned immediately, their hulls stripped and sold for scrap. Others served into the 1950s, converted for different roles, their flight decks repurposed for helicopter operations or training exercises. A few disappeared entirely, lost to storms or accidents in the years after the war, their names fading from official records, but lingering in the memories of men who had served aboard them. The Casablanca, first of Kaiser's impossibilities, was scrapped in 1947. Workers who had built her read the notice in newspapers and felt a peculiar sadness, as though something they had birthed had been killed prematurely. But the war had taught them that nothing was permanent, that even steel bent to the demands of time and economics. Kaiser himself moved on to other ventures, applying his methods to housing, to automobiles, to healthcare. He became a titan of American industry, his name synonymous with innovation and scale. But those who worked for him in Vancouver remembered him differently, not as a magnate, but as the man who had stood beside them in the fog and promised the impossible, then helped them achieve it. Decades later, when historians assessed the Second World War's turning points, Kaiser's shipyards received footnotes rather than chapters. The escort carriers were not glamorous enough for legend, too practical for myth. Yet their impact rippled through every convoy that arrived safely, every landing that succeeded because air cover circled overhead, every submarine that turned away because a CVE's aircraft hunted nearby. Margaret Dalton lived to see her grandchildren grow, and she told them stories of the war years, though she softened the edges, omitting the exhaustion and the fear. She showed them photographs of the shipyard, black and white images where tiny figures swarmed over vast hulls. "I was there," she would say, pointing to a crane barely visible in the background. "I helped build that." Her grandchildren, raised in prosperity and peace, struggled to imagine it. A world where their grandmother operated heavy machinery, where women welded steel, where ships were built in months instead of years. It seemed like fiction, a story too extraordinary to be true. But Margaret kept the letter from the Mission Bay sailor, and when her grandchildren doubted, she would show it to them. The paper now fragile and yellowed, the words still clear. Tom Briggs never spoke much about the war. When asked, he would shrug and say he had been a foreman, nothing more. But his son, who survived the Pacific and returned home, knew better. He had seen the escort carriers, had watched them work in the waters off Okinawa and the Philippines. He knew that his father's hands had shaped the steel that protected him, and that knowledge created a bond deeper than words could express. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, a reunion was held in Vancouver for workers from Kaiser's Shipyard. Fewer than 100 attended, most of them elderly, their bodies bearing the wear of decades, but their eyes still bright when they spoke of the carriers. They walked the riverbank where the yard had stood, now replaced by industrial parks and warehouses, and remembered the fog, the cranes, the endless rhythm of construction. Margaret attended, frail but determined. She stood at the water's edge with other crane operators, women whose names she had forgotten, but whose faces she recognized. They did not speak much. There was no need. They had shared something that transcended language, a moment in history when they had been essential, when their work had mattered more than anything they would do afterward. One of the women, her hair white and her hands gnarled with arthritis, whispered, "We built something that lasted." Margaret thought of the carriers scrapped decades ago, of the steel recycled and reformed into bridges and buildings. She thought of the sailors who had died despite her best efforts, of the ships that had sunk, of all the ways that permanence was an illusion. But then she thought of the convoys that had arrived, of the Marines who had landed, of the war that had been won, in part because she and thousands like her had refused to believe that 15 carriers in 12 months was impossible. And she realized the woman was right. They had built something that lasted, not in steel, but in the proof of what ordinary people could achieve when history demanded it. The reunion ended as the sun set over the Columbia River, the water turning gold and red, the same colors it had been on those mornings when the yard hummed with life. The survivors dispersed, returning to homes and families, carrying with them the quiet knowledge that they had been part of something larger than themselves. Kaiser had been right, though not in the way he perhaps intended. The carriers were not the miracle. The workers were. The system he created had allowed them to channel their fear and hope into something tangible, to take the abstractions of war and render them in rivets and welds, in flight decks and hulls that floated when they should have sunk, that worked when they should have failed. The lesson of the Vancouver shipyard was not about speed or efficiency, though both were achieved. It was about belief. The belief that when the need is great enough and the cause just enough, ordinary people can accomplish the extraordinary. That mothers can operate cranes, that farmers can weld steel, that a shipyard in the Pacific Northwest can outpace every prediction and rewrite the rules of naval construction. The escort carriers launched from Kaiser's yard did not win the war alone. No single weapon, no matter how numerous, could claim that. But they were threads in a larger tapestry, part of the overwhelming material advantage that turned American industrial capacity into the war's decisive factor. The Japanese had fought with courage and skill, but they could not match production. The Germans had built engineering marvels, but they could not sustain them. And the Americans had built ships, thousands upon thousands of ships, until the oceans themselves seemed to buckle under the weight of steel. Margaret Dalton died in 2003, at the age of 92. Her obituary mentioned her work at the shipyard in a single sentence: a footnote to a life measured in children and grandchildren, in community service and quiet dignity. But those who knew her best understood that the war years had defined her in ways nothing else could. She had stood 70 feet above the Columbia River and moved steel with precision and purpose. She had helped build the impossible. And in doing so, she had proven that the true arsenal of democracy was not its factories or its ships, but its people. The fog still rolls over the Columbia River on autumn mornings, wrapping the water in grey silence. The shipyard is gone, replaced by the slow commerce of a peacetime economy. But sometimes, if you stand at the river's edge and listen, you can almost hear the echo of cranes swinging through mist, of workers calling to each other across assemblyways, of hulls sliding into water with the sound of thunder rolling through valleys. 15 escort carriers in 12 months. The promise that seemed impossible in October of 1942, the achievement that became routine by autumn of 1943, the legacy that outlasted the ships themselves, living on in the memories of those who built them and the children they raised in the peace their work had secured. Henry Kaiser had promised the Navy something they could not imagine, and then, with the help of 15,000 workers who believed because he did, he delivered it, not through genius or magic, but through the simple, relentless application of will to steel, of hope to hardship, of faith to the fog-shrouded morning when the first hull touched water and proved that impossibility was just another word for challenge not yet met. The carriers are gone now, their steel recycled, their names relegated to history books and naval registers. But what they represented endures, the proof that when faced with darkness, ordinary people can forge light, that when told something cannot be done, Americans have a habit of doing it anyway, and that sometimes, in the crucible of war, the greatest weapons are not the ships themselves, but the hands that built them and the hearts that refused to surrender to doubt. The sun sets over the Columbia River, and the water carries no memory of the steel it once received. But the land remembers, the people remember, and in that remembrance lies the truth that Kaiser understood from the beginning, that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in shipyards and factories, in the hands of crane operators and welders, in the faith of ordinary people doing extraordinary work because their country asked, and because they could not imagine refusing. 15 carriers in 12 months, a promise kept, a world changed, a legacy forged in fog and steel that will echo as long as anyone remembers what it means to build the impossible and launch it into the waiting river, trusting that it will float, that it will fight, and that it will bring their children home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.